What's up, guys? This is Toad. This is Better Off Dead. College football week 1 is what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be breaking down 3 plays that I think are the top plays of the week, at least from what I've seen so far. Week 1 is a little bit tough because it's the first week, so you don't really have teams coming out of like a big game already that you can fade or anything like that, which is one of the angles that I tend to like to look at. And you have a lot of the better teams, the bigger name teams playing cupcakes, and you got a bunch of like 20, 30-point spreads, and I tend to not want to have anything to do with games like that because those teams can kind of just dictate the score, so even if they don't totally show up, I find it to still be kind of risky to get involved in games like that, like the games that are more competitive, of course. So I'm going to be sharing my screen here, what I'm looking at. So the first game I'm looking at is on Saturday, 7 p.m., Texas San Antonio at Houston. And this is week 1. I tend to look at how many returning starters teams have, and I tend to look at what the market is doing. So this one jumped out at me right away because you can see, first of all, Texas San Antonio, they're a team nobody even really knows who they are. I think they might have moved into the American Football Conference now, and they were in the Sun Belt before that. I can't even remember. They were a good team in their conference last year, but people don't know who they are, and everybody knows who Houston is, kind of a bigger name team, and Houston is just moving up to the Big 12. So this is kind of one of those numbers that looks like a trap where you're looking at it, and it's like, this game is at Houston. Why would they be a home underdog against some smaller school like Texas San Antonio? And these teams actually, I don't know if they play each other every year, but they did play each other in week 1 last year, and it was a crazy triple overtime game that Houston, I believe, wound up winning by the skin of their teeth by 2 right at the end. And Texas San Antonio is definitely more competitive than the average observer would think that they are. And you can see here, I'm also looking at, you see Texas San Antonio has more of the money than the ticket percentage. Ticket percentage, 61% tracked at the books that pregame.com is tracking here, 64% of the money. So all of that, and the line, as you can see here, is moved from them being a 2.5-point dog to a 2.5-point favorite, although a line move through 0 I don't find really matters that much. You're still kind of just going with who's going to win the game. And these week 1 lines, they do move quite a bit, but I don't have that much hesitation betting a little bit later on them. As long as you don't get like the worst number and you think it's a good situation, I still don't have that much of a problem doing it, especially when it's a number where it's basically just pick the winner here. Talking about the returning starters, though, you have Houston. Last year, they had the quarterback wide receiver tandem of Toon and Dell, and both of them are now gone. They've both moved on to the NFL, I believe. Both got drafted, and they've lost a bunch of their players on defense. I believe they've lost 8 out of 9 of their top starters or something along those lines. And switch over to Texas San Antonio. Texas San Antonio, I believe, is returning at least 14 of their starters. I might have that wrong. It might even be more than that. They're returning a bunch of their starters. Texas San Antonio, they have their quarterback, Harris, who's like one of the best players that they've ever had. He's returning. So this is a team where, Harris is returning. This is a situation where you get the bigger name team, and it looks very strange that they're the underdog, but they're an underdog for a reason, man. It's because they've lost a bunch of their key players from last year. They're having to rebuild. They're moving into a new conference. So they might be kind of looking ahead to having that type of schedule. And again, it's like, why is the number 2.5 here? Texas San Antonio is the way to go. And you can actually find better numbers than that. I found 1.5, minus 1.5 Texas San Antonio. I'm taking that. So that's play number 1. The second play I'm going to be talking about is South Alabama against Tulane, and I'm actually holding off on this right now because you can see this number is hovering right around 7. It's at 6.5 right now, and I think that around game time, if we get to Saturday, it's possible that it might move back up to 7. I don't really care if it drops from 6.5 to 6. Those numbers aren't as key, so I don't think it matters that much between taking 6 or 6.5. So if you can wait on that, and that's the only risk that you're taking. But in waiting, you can get that number to move back to 7, and you can take the 7. That's what I would do. So obviously I'm saying I'm going to take South Alabama in this game plus the points. And this is another situation where you have South Alabama. They're returning almost all of their starters from last year. I believe they're returning 9 starters on offense and defense from last year's team. And last year's team, just like with Texas San Antonio, last year's team went to a bowl game. And South Alabama, their coach is now a third-year coach, which is usually when you see that coach, like kind of all of his recruits are kind of in place at this point. His system's all in place, and that's usually you see where they like take this leap. But that combined with having all those returning starters, and they're an unranked team, as you can see here, and they're facing Tulane, who is a ranked team, but Tulane has lost a bunch of their players from last year. I think they had about 7 players get drafted into the NFL. I believe they lost a bunch of their players on defense, and they have a new defensive coordinator come in, and I think they almost had a different defensive coordinator with Lance Guidry, I believe, or maybe they already had him, but he like unexpectedly moved on, and he went to Miami. So I don't see Tulane's defense really being up to the task right away to start this season. And Tulane, the last time anybody saw them, people remember, and I actually had a bet on them in the bowl game last year. They had one of the best seasons they've ever had as a college football program last year, and I think played above, well, certainly above expectations, but above what their talent level actually was too. And they went into a bowl against a USC team who I thought was pretty disappointed to wind up landing, even though it was one of the big 6 New Year's 6 bowls. USC kind of was disappointed and dropped into that and had to face a team that's not really a big-name team in Tulane, and that was like a crazy game that went down to the wire. Tulane won that game, pulled off, I believe it was a mild upset. The line was really close, which, again, was the reason why I bet Tulane, because it was like, why is the line so close to like a pick'em spread in that one? But everybody remembers Tulane being really good last year, playing out of their minds last year. This year, I think they have to be taking a step back after that with so many players that they're losing to the NFL draft, among other things. South Alabama returning maybe the most starters in college football. They're up there as far as the number of returning starters, with 18 out of the 22 returning starters, including most of the key players, including their really great quarterback. So I like South Alabama getting too many points here as far as I'm concerned, but I would wait on this. I'm fine with taking the 6.5 if we don't see the 7, but if you can get the 7, I would do that. So South Alabama, we can mark it as plus 6.5, but I would take them plus 7 if it gets there. And the final game I'm going to be looking at is UCLA against Coastal Carolina. And in this one, you can see this is another one that kind of jumped out at me because you have a big-name team, again, in UCLA against a team that nobody really talks about that much, Coastal Carolina. Even though Coastal Carolina has been a good program, they've been to a bunch of bowls recently, people still just kind of overlook that team. And you can see here, it looks like UCLA is getting way more of the ticket percentage than the money percentage, just like with that Texas San Antonio game. But this is even more drastic, which this indicates, and of course, as you expect, the public likes UCLA. You're going to get a lot of small public bets on UCLA, but this is telling you the bigger money bets are going the other way, and they're taking the points with Coastal Carolina. And you can get 14.5 right now. It's pretty much across the board, 14.5. Coastal Carolina plus 14.5 is going to be the play. And what we have here, UCLA, we have a situation where they are saying that they're going to be using like 3 quarterbacks this year, which could maybe be a slight disadvantage to Coastal Carolina because they don't know who or what they're going to be facing. But I think it's more of kind of a messy situation for UCLA's offense, where they have these new guys coming in on their offense. They're replacing about half of their offense personnel-wise, but I think I would say more than half, because Thompson Robinson, their quarterback from last year, Charbonnet, their running back, and Bobo, their best wide receiver, all are gone this year. So they're having to replace all of the key players on their offense, and I don't expect their offense to be like clicking right away, especially with that weird situation where they're saying they're going to play all 3 of their quarterbacks, one of them being a freshman, one of them being Garbers, who was there last year, and then Their third is transfer. I forget where they got him from. But it's not a great situation for the UCLA offense. And their defense, they did lose their defensive coordinator. They hired a new defensive coordinator earlier this year, and then their defensive coordinator they had last year actually died after that happened. And you might say, well, that might like fire up the team. It might spark the team. Maybe that's true, but I think it would be more of a spark if he was still there as their defense coordinator, if he was still in that position, but he had already been, he'd stepped down, I believe, and he had already been replaced before that. So I think and it was earlier this year. So a lot of time's passed since then, so it's not fresh in memory. So I think that's going to be a little bit less of a spark for UCLA. And having a new defensive coordinator in there, I think it's going to take a little while for that defense to kind of get up to speed with his type of system, even though it might be a similar system to last year. So even though UCLA is a pretty big name team that can kind of reload when they lose a bunch of starters like this, I still think they're not going to be like firing on all cylinders right away. And Coastal Carolina is returning more of their starters from last year. They got McCall, their quarterback, who was really good last year. He's back. Beasley, their best running back from last year, is back. And Pinckney, their top wide receiver from last year. All those guys are back. They kind of got embarrassed in the bowl game last year. So I think that kind of might fire them up, as they had a pretty bad ending to the season last year, and they have their sights on like winning that conference championship. I believe they were in the Sun Belt last year, and they still are. So that might fire them up. I think it's going to fire them up, the fact they're playing a big name team here, UCLA. They're playing on the road to do it, but they get all that travel in line with time to spare because it's the first game of the season. So that's going to be less of a disadvantage to them having to travel like that. They'll be able to get their biological clocks used to the West Coast and stuff like that with not having to turn around on like a short week or anything like that, or on a week's time. So Coastal Carolina, I think getting 14.5 points is quite a bit. I like that. They do have a new head coach, so that is a little bit of a disadvantage where these guys might take a little while to adjust to that system, but because they're returning all those guys on offense, and I think they are returning a bunch of guys on both sides of the ball too. So I like all of that situation. All three of these plays are situations where the team that I'm going against has lost like a bunch of their key players, and I think they're being overvalued. So those are going to be Texas San Antonio -1.5. What was the second one? Going against Tulane, South Alabama +6.5 or +7 if you can get it, and Coastal Carolina +14.5. That's going to do it for college football week 1. I am Toad. And follow my other show, the very offensive comedy show, Tower Gang, the Tower Gang Pod. You can find us on most of the platforms at Tower Gang Pod everywhere. I'm Tower Gang Toad again. This is Better Off Dead. This was college football week 1. Hopefully this wasn't too much of an autistic spurg out for you. But let's hopefully win these plays.